There are towns that see everything and remember nothing. And people who survive long enough to stop expecting anything to change. Then one morning, something lands on the counter that shouldn't exist. He didn't come in asking. He came in knowing.
The coin hit the counter on a Tuesday morning in October, and the sound it made was different from anything that had happened in Millhaven in a long time. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was simply a single gold coin placed with deliberate care on the worn wooden surface of the mercantile counter, and the weight of it, the specific heavy ring of real gold against old wood, cut through the noise of the store the way a church bell cuts through wind. Everyone heard it. Everyone stopped. Margaret Cole had been standing behind that counter since 6 in the morning. She had been threading needles and measuring calico and writing numbers in a ledger that never quite added up to enough. And she had been doing all of this with the particular focused economy of a woman who has learned that the moment you stop moving, the things you are trying not to think about will find you. She was 26 years old. She had the hands of someone 10 years older. And when she looked up from the ledger and saw the coin and then the man who had placed it there, she did not reach for it. She simply looked. He was not what Millhaven produced. That was the first thing she understood. The town had a type, the men who came through its one main street, the ranchers with their weathered confidence, the cowboys with their performative ease, the traveling merchants with their too wide smiles. This man was none of those things. He was somewhere past 30 with dark eyes that were doing something she could not immediately name, not assessing her the way men assessed women, not calculating, not soft with false warmth. He was simply looking at her as though he had come a long way to do exactly this and intended to do it correctly. His coat was worn at both elbows. His boots had been resoled at least twice, and the left toe had a crack running along the seam that no amount of resoling was going to fix. There was dust still settling off his shoulders from the road, which meant he had ridden in that morning and come directly here without stopping. He held his hat in both hands in front of him, not with nervousness, with the deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and is now executing it. He said 2 words, "Marry me." The mercantile went so quiet that Margaret could hear the tick of the clock on the far wall and the distant sound of someone's wagon on the street outside. Dorothy Haynes, who had been examining a bolt of blue wool in the corner, went completely still. The stock boy in the back stopped moving. Margaret was aware of all of this, the way you are aware of a room you are standing in without needing to look at it. She looked at the coin. It was a $20 gold piece. Not a token, not something a man found in the road and thought to use for theater. Real gold, the kind that most people in Millhaven handle perhaps twice in their lives. She could see the worn smoothness of one side the way a coin gets when someone has carried it for a long time, turning it in their pocket, holding it in their palm on difficult days. This coin had been with someone for a while, and they had placed it here on this counter for a reason. She looked back at the man. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "You don't." His voice was level, not cold, not warm. The voice of a man who has thought carefully about what he is going to say and has decided that honesty requires a certain plainness. "Then why would you ask that?" "Because I need a wife," he said, "and I think you need something too." Margaret had spent 7 years in Millhaven being underestimated. She had spent 7 years watching people look at her and see a problem, a charity case, a woman who had drawn a poor hand and was managing it with varying degrees of dignity. She had learned to read the quality of attention people paid her very quickly, the way you learn to read weather when your livelihood depends on it. This man was not looking at her like a problem. She became aware again of the listening silence behind her Dorothy Haynes and the stock boy and whoever else had stopped breathing to hear what happened next. "One coin doesn't buy a wife," she said. "No," he said. "It doesn't, but it tells you I'm serious." He reached up and adjusted his hat brim just enough for her to see his eyes more clearly. Dark brown, steady in a way that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with a man who knew exactly where he stood. "My name is Everett Harlow," he said. "I have a place north of here toward the mountains. I can give you a home, food, security, whatever your family needs." She heard the word family and felt something shift behind her sternum. "What do you know about my family?" she said. It was not quite a question. He was quiet for a moment. The clock ticked. "Your brother Danny," he said. "He's been at Doc Ellison's for 2 weeks. The bill is past due. You have 3 days before they send him home." The mercantile was still perfectly silent. Margaret did not move. She did not reach for the coin or step back from the counter or let anything happen in her face that she had not decided to let happen. She had been doing this for 7 years, holding herself steady in public while everything else moved, and she was very good at it. "How do you know that?" she said. He looked at her without flinching. "Small town," he said. "People talk." "People talk," she repeated. "Yes." She studied him for a long moment. He did not fill the silence. He did not try to soften what he had said or add to it or walk any of it back. He simply waited with a patience that was somehow more unnerving than urgency would have been. Dorothy Haynes cleared her throat from the corner. Margaret did not turn around. "Mrs. Haynes," she said, her voice perfectly even. "I don't believe I asked for your opinion." Dorothy's throat clearing stopped. Margaret looked back at Everett Harlow. "Give me until tomorrow morning," she said. He nodded once, put his hat back on, walked out of the mercantile without another word, and the door swung shut behind him, and then every person in that store started talking at once. Margaret picked up the coin. She put it in her apron pocket. She went back to threading needles. She did not sleep that night. She sat at the small table in the 2-room house she rented on the east side of Millhaven, the gold coin in the center of the table, her sewing untouched beside it. Through the thin wall, she could hear Danny's breathing. Not the wet, rattling cough of the bad weeks, but still shallow, still careful, still the breathing of a body that was working harder than it should have to work just to keep itself going. Danny was 16 years old and looked 12. The fever had taken weight off him that he had not had to spare. He had their mother's eyes sharp and watchful and catching light in ways that made people stop mid-sentence when they looked at him. He had always been like that, too sharp for his own comfort, sometimes aware of things he was too young to have to be aware of. Margaret was 26 years old. She had been the head of this family since she was 19, since the fever took their mother in the spring of 1876, and their father rode out that same summer and did not come back. 7 years of stretching $3 until it felt like 10. 7 years of taking in sewing until her fingers bled, of smiling at women who looked through her, of making every decision alone in the dark, and then getting up in the morning and going back to work. She had survived. She had kept Danny alive. She had done every single thing a person was supposed to do, and it still was not enough. Doc Ellison had been kinder than he needed to be. He had a business to run and a family of his own, and he had carried Danny's bill for 2 weeks because Margaret had asked him to and because he was a decent man. But decent men had limits, and he had told her on Monday quietly out of Danny's hearing that he could not carry the debt past the end of the week. She turned the coin over in her palm. She thought about his eyes, the way Everett Harlow had looked at her, not like a woman who needed saving, not with the pitying warmth that men in this town had spent 7 years directing at her. He had looked at her like she was a person considering a transaction, and he was presenting terms and waiting to find out whether she agreed. There was respect in that. Not warmth yet, but respect. She thought about the things he had said. He had known Danny's name. He had known the amount of the bill. He had known the 3-day timeline. She turned the coin over again and thought about what it meant that a stranger had arrived in Millhaven, knowing those specific things before he ever walked into her store. That was not gossip. Gossip was general. What Everett Harlow had known was specific. It was the kind of specific that came from intention, from a man who had done deliberate research before making a deliberate move. At 4 in the morning, Danny called from the other room. Not in distress. half awake the way he got when the nights were long. "Maggie!" She went to him, sat on the edge of his bed. He looked up at her with those two old eyes, and she could see him reading her face the way he had been reading her face since he was small. "You didn't sleep," he said. "I was thinking." "About what?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "A man came into the store today. He asked me to marry him." Danny was very still. "What kind of man?" "I'm not sure yet." She turned the coin over once in her fingers. "He gave me this." Danny looked at it. His eyes went wide just slightly, the way they did when he was genuinely surprised, which was not often. "That's a $20 gold piece." "I know." He was quiet for a moment with that young old quality of his processing. "What are you going to do?" Margaret closed her fingers around the coin. "I think," she said slowly, "I'm going to say yes." Danny looked at her for a long time. He did not argue. He did not ask if she was sure. He simply looked at her with those eyes that had always seemed to understand more than they should, and then he said, "All right," and turned over and went back to sleep. And Margaret sat there on the edge of his bed and understood that she had made her decision before she knew she had made it. She found Everett Harlow the next morning at the north end of town, where the main street ended and the road began its long climb toward the mountains. He was sitting on a fence post eating an apple, his horse tied to the post beside him, a large gray animal that looked unremarkable until you looked at it carefully. Then you saw the quality of the muscle in its hindquarters, the careful conditioning of its hooves, the grain that must have gone into a horse that looked like that. Whatever else Everett Harlow was, he understood horses and horses cost money, and this horse represented more money than his coat suggested he had. He saw her coming and stood up without hurrying. "I have conditions," Margaret said. Something moved in his expression that might have been the early edge of respect. "All right. My brother comes with me. Whatever you're offering, it covers him completely. His medicine, his care, everything he needs until he's well. That's not negotiable." "Agreed." She had expected him to think about it. His immediate agreement threw her off enough that she paused before continuing. "I want to see where we're going before I commit to anything permanent. I want to know what your home actually looks like." "I can't show you in advance," he said, "but I give you my word you won't be disappointed." "Your word," she said carefully. "I don't know what your word is worth yet." "No," he said. "You don't, not yet." He met her gaze. "But you'll find out." She studied him, the worn coat, the resoled boots, the simple hat that had been through weather more times than it had seen a hat rack. Nothing about him said wealth, but there was something in the way he held himself, a gravity, a quiet certainty that was nothing like arrogance that kept pulling her attention back in ways she could not entirely account for. "One more condition," she said. "This is a partnership, not a transaction. I'm not agreeing to be furniture in someone's house. If I come with you, I work. I contribute. I have a real voice in decisions." For the first time since she had met him, Everett Harlow smiled. It was small and brief, and it changed his face entirely into something younger and less defended, and then it was gone. "Agreed," he said. "All three." She put out her hand. He shook it firm and direct the handshake of a man who meant what he was doing. "Day after tomorrow," he said. "That gives you time to settle things here." She nodded and turned to go. "Miss Cole." She looked back. "Thank you," he said. And he meant it. She could hear it in the plainness of it, in the way he did not add anything to it, or soften it, or make it into something more comfortable than what it was. She did not answer. She walked back toward town with the gold coin still in her pocket, and the particular unsettling sensation of a woman who has just made either the best or the worst decision of her life and genuinely cannot tell which. Millhaven made sure she understood their position on the matter. By that afternoon, the news had traveled from one end of town to the other with the efficiency that only very small towns can achieve. Margaret Cole was marrying the drifter, the nobody cowboy who had ridden in from nowhere 3 days ago and apparently thought a gold coin was sufficient currency for a wife. She heard it at the dry goods store. She heard it through the walls of her rented house when Mrs. Garfield next door had her sister to supper and did not lower her voice. That poor girl. Desperate is what she is. A cowboy with no land, no name, no nothing. She's throwing herself away. Margaret sat at her sewing table and kept her hands moving. Thread in, thread out. The rhythm of it had kept her steady for 7 years, and it kept her steady now. What she did not do was cry. She had cried when her mother died. She had cried when her father left. She had done it privately in the dark where no one could witness it. And then she had gotten up and gone back to work. She was done letting Millhaven see her break. Dorothy Haynes came to the shop the next morning, which meant she considered the situation serious enough to leave her house before 10, which almost never happened. She sat down across the work table without being invited. Margaret, she said in the tone of a woman who has decided this conversation is going to happen, regardless of whether anyone wants it to, I am going to speak plainly. When have you ever done otherwise? Margaret said without looking up. Dorothy's expression tightened. This man has nothing. He rode in from nowhere. You are going to work yourself to the bone for someone who cannot even afford new boots. Margaret kept sewing. He had a $20 gold piece. One coin does not make a man reliable. No, Margaret agreed. It doesn't. Then why? Margaret set down her needle. She looked at Dorothy directly, and Dorothy, who had been looking through Margaret for years, found herself on the receiving end of attention that was not comfortable. In 7 years, Margaret said, 7 years of keeping this shop running and keeping Danny alive and doing everything right. How many men in this town have looked me in the eye and spoken to me like I was a full person and not a problem to feel sorry for? Dorothy did not answer. He did, Margaret said. First conversation, 15 minutes. She picked her needle back up. Maybe that means nothing. Maybe I get up there and find out I've made a terrible mistake, but I've made decisions with worse odds than that. Dorothy stood, straightened her coat. I hope you know what you're doing. So do I, Margaret said quietly. The morning they left, 3 people came to see them off. Doc Ellison, who shook Margaret's hand and told her that Danny's remaining days of care had already been paid in full. He showed her the receipt. $20 settled the previous afternoon. She looked at Everett. He was checking the harness on the lead horse and did not meet her eyes. Old Mr. Farrow from the mercantile, who pressed a small paper package into her hands. Needles thread a small pair of scissors. He told her she was the best customer he'd ever had and that he hoped she found good land and good people wherever she was going. And Danny himself, bundled in his coat, still pale but standing on his own 2 feet for the first time in 2 weeks, who looked at Everett Harlow for a long assessing moment with that particular gaze of his. You'll take care of her, Danny said. It was not a question. Everett looked at him with something that appeared to be genuine surprise, as if the challenge had come from an unexpected direction. We'll take care of each other, he said. Danny considered this with the seriousness of someone rendering a verdict they have thought through carefully. Then he gave a short nod and climbed into the wagon. Margaret helped settle him in the back. Everett took the reins. The wagon rolled north out of Millhaven, and the town watched from behind its curtains and its door frames, and no one waved goodbye. Everett did not look back. Neither did Margaret. The first day of travel was quiet in the way that 2 people who do not yet know each other can be quiet. Not comfortably, not uncomfortably, but with a careful attention on both sides, each one aware of the other without making a performance of it. Danny slept in the wagon bed, exhausted from the effort of simply getting upright and moving. Margaret sat on the bench beside Everett and watched the country change as they moved north, the flat main street of Millhaven giving way to rolling pasture, the pasture to heavier timber, the road narrowing, the mountains growing larger and more specific ahead of them. She had not been outside of Millhaven in 4 years. She had forgotten how large the world was. After an hour of silence, she said, Where did you grow up? Montana, Everett said. Different part of it. Family. A brief pause. Not anymore. I'm sorry. Don't be, he said without bitterness. It was a long time ago. She tried a different direction. What did you do before you came to Millhaven? He was quiet for a moment. Manage things, he said. Manage what things? He glanced at her sideways and she caught the ghost of that small smile again. You're curious. You asked me to marry you after 15 minutes of conversation, she said. I think curiosity is appropriate. He actually laughed at that, a short, genuine sound that she suspected he did not produce very often. Fair point, he said. He looked back at the road. I managed a ranch. Your ranch. The pause was just slightly too long. A ranch, he said. She kept that thought and moved past it. What she noticed instead as the hours passed was how he handled the horses. Firmly and confidently, with a touch that was sure without being hard. How he read the road ahead, noting a soft patch of ground before they reached it, steering around it without comment. How his eyes moved constantly, cataloging the landscape around them, with the practiced attention of a man who had spent years learning to read land. He was not performing competence. He simply had it. That evening they made camp at the edge of a creek. Everett had known it was there. He had said simply half a mile back that they would stop ahead, and a half mile later there was the creek clear and fast, over flat stones, exactly as if he had read the map of this country from memory. Danny was awake by then, groggy but functional, and he sat by the fire Everett built and ate the food Everett had packed. Real food. Bread and dried beef and a wedge of good hard cheese that cost more than trail supplies usually did. Danny watched Everett with those sharp eyes of his while he ate. You know this country, Danny said. Everett stirred the fire. Well enough. You've been through here before. A few times. Danny chewed his bread and thought about this. The food's good. That's a low bar, Everett said. Danny grinned. It was the first real grin Margaret had seen from him in weeks. You're all right, he pronounced in the tone of someone delivering a verdict they considered important. Everett looked at him with an expression that was almost warm. Get some sleep. Still 2 days to go. That night after Danny had rolled back into his blankets and the fire had burned down to coals, Margaret sat in the quiet and looked at the stars through the gap in the timber and tried to organize her thoughts into something she could work with. She was 3 hours north of Millhaven, heading into mountains she had never been inside of, beside a man she had known for 2 days. She had either saved her brother or destroyed herself. Possibly both. She looked across the dying fire at Everett, who had his back to a tree and his hat tilted low. Asleep or near it. She thought about what Danny had said. You're all right. Danny had good instincts. He had always had good instincts. He had been right about people more often than not, and he had been wrong about them seldom enough that she had learned to weight his assessments seriously. She held on to that and closed her eyes. The second day, everything started to feel different. The road had narrowed to a trail, and the trail was edged on both sides by timber so old and dense, it felt like traveling through something that had been standing long before anyone thought to give it a name. Light came through at angles gold and green and shifting with the wind. Twice they crossed wooden bridges over fast-moving streams, and both bridges were built with a quality that stopped Margaret each time. Well-maintained, solidly engineered, far too well constructed for a wilderness track that supposedly led nowhere. She noted the bridges. She noted the fence lines she could see occasionally through the trees, long and straight, with posts that had been set by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and had the materials to do it right. She noted the way Everett's posture changed as they went deeper into the mountains. Not tension, the gradual easing of a man who has been holding himself carefully in company and is now slowly allowing himself to be at rest. She watched all of this and said nothing. On the afternoon of the second day, they stopped at the crest of a long ridge. Everett sat back on the reins and turned to look at her. She had been looking at him already. She had been watching his face for the last hour, tracking something she could not name, a preparation of some kind. Before we go over, he said. His voice was different, something in it that had not been there before. She looked at him and felt her attention sharpen in the specific way it sharpened when something important was about to happen. All right, she said. I wasn't entirely honest with you in Millhaven, he said, about what I have. The silence that followed was very full, the wind in the pines, the horses shifting, Danny somewhere in the wagon behind them, still and listening. "Everett," she said, and kept her voice level with the same steadiness she had been keeping things level with for 7 years. "What are we about to see on the other side of this ridge?" He held her gaze. "My home," he said, "what it actually looks like." And he clicked the horses forward before she could say another word. She heard it before she saw it. Not the estate itself, something else. The sound of cattle low and widespread, the deep, unhurried murmur of a large herd settled in the late afternoon, a sound she had never heard up close, but which registered somewhere below. Conscious understanding as the sound of something very large. The sound of it rose from below, rich and heavy, and with it the smell of hay and worked earth and clean cold air, with something wood smoke sweet beneath it all. Then they cleared the tree line at the edge of the ridge, and Margaret Cole stopped breathing. The valley below was impossible. That was the first word that came to her, and it was not quite right, but it was the closest she had. The valley floor was green, an unnatural, vivid green for late October, which meant irrigation, which meant engineering, which meant a level of resource and planning she could not immediately calculate. The fencing was not the rough wire she had glimpsed through the trees. It was proper ranch fencing, miles of it, perfectly maintained, running in straight lines across the valley floor like geometry imposed on wilderness. The barns were enormous. 3 of them roofs, solid sides, straight built to last generations rather than seasons. Beyond them, smaller buildings, a bunkhouse, what appeared to be a smithy, structures she could not name from this distance. And they're set back from the working buildings on a small natural rise, the house. It was not a farmhouse. It was a mansion. 2 full stories of cut stone and good timber, with a covered porch running the full length of the front, and windows that caught the falling afternoon light and returned it doubled. The kind of house that took years to build. The kind of house that required not just money, but will, a sustained intention across decades, a vision held steady through weather and difficulty and time. Margaret turned very slowly to look at Everett Harlow. He was watching her face with an expression she had not seen on him before. Careful, vulnerable, waiting. "Who are you?" she said. His jaw moved. "The same man you agreed to marry." "That mom," she said with great precision, "is not a poor cowboy's home." "No," he said quietly. "It's not, Everett." Her voice was absolutely steady. Everything inside her was not steady at all. "I want the truth right now, before we go 1 foot further." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he set the brake on the wagon and climbed down and came around to her side and stood below her, looking up. And for the first time she saw something in his face that was not composure, not patience, not that careful stillness he wore like a second coat. She saw something that looked underneath all of it, like a man who was genuinely deeply afraid. "My name is Everett Harlow," he said. "My father, Nathaniel Harlow, registered and surveyed this valley in 1847. He started building the estate in 1853, from 40 acres and a handshake and a will that didn't know how to quit. He died in 1880. All of it passed to me." The wind moved in the pines above them. "Then why?" Margaret said with the precision of a woman cutting fabric to an exact measurement. "Were you in Mill Haven wearing a coat with holes in the elbows, asking a seamstress to marry you?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I have been looking for 3 years for someone who would see me. Just me, without all of this in the way." He held her gaze. "Every time I told the truth about what I had, all anyone could see was the estate." He paused. "I needed to know if you would still choose me when there was nothing to gain." Margaret looked at him for a very long time. Then she looked down at the valley, at the mansion, at the barns, at the miles of perfect fencing, at the herd that moved below like a slow, dark river. Then she looked back at him. "You let me assume," she said. "You knew what I was thinking, and you let me assume it." "Yes." He did not flinch from it. "That is still a lie, Everett. A lie by omission is still a lie." He took that. He held it the way a man holds something he has earned and knows he has earned. "Yes," he said. You're right. Behind them, Danny had gone completely silent in the wagon. Margaret looked at the valley one more time and felt the whole weight of what she was looking at, not just the land and the buildings and the impossible green of the irrigated pasture, but all the things that had brought her to this ridge. The two-room rented house, the stretched dollars, the 7 years of just enough and never quite enough, Danny's cough, through the thin wall at 4 in the morning, the ledger that never added up. She thought about the handshake at the fence post, the 3 conditions, the way he had said, "We'll take care of each other," to a sick 16-year-old boy without hesitating even for a moment. None of that changed because of what was at the bottom of this ridge. But something else had changed, something that mattered. She did not know yet what she was going to do with it. "Take us down," she said. He looked at her sharply. "I didn't say I forgave you," she said. "I said take us down. I want to see what else you haven't told me." He looked at her for a moment with something that was very clearly relief. Not triumph, not satisfaction. The relief of a man who has been bracing for the worst and has been given instead something more complicated and more honest than the worst. He climbed back up. He took the reins. The wagon rolled forward over the ridge and began the long descent into the hidden valley, and the evening light fell golden across the mansion and the barns and the green, impossible pastures. And Margaret Cole sat with her hands folded in her lap and felt the whole shape of her life shifting beneath her like ground that has just revealed it was not as solid as she had believed. She was not afraid, but she was paying very close attention. And in the wagon behind her, Danny Cole, 16 years old, and nobody's fool, looked out over the valley with wide eyes, and then looked at the back of Everett Harlow's head and allowed himself a small private smile that his sister did not see. Because Danny had known from the moment of the handshake on that first morning, from the quality of the food and the bridges in the forest, and the way a man who claimed to have nothing sat a horse like he owned every acre beneath its feet. He had known something was different about this man. He just had not known how different. Now he did, and he had already decided that he approved. The first person to meet them at the bottom of the ridge was Silas Dern. He came out from the main barn at a deliberate walk, not hurrying, not performing calm, simply moving at the pace of a man who has been running things long enough to know that the quality of your first step tells people everything about whether you can be trusted with the rest of them. He was somewhere past 60 with a white beard cropped close and hands that looked like they had been shaped by decades of work, the way wood gets shaped by weather, not damaged by it, refined. He wore the same kind of worn, practical clothing as Everett, but on Silas, it read differently. On Silas, it read like a man who had earned the right to stop caring about appearances a long time ago. He saw the wagon and came toward it, and when he saw Everett on the bench, his whole face changed in a way that was not surprise and not quite relief, but something warmer than either. The face of a man who had been waiting for something he was not entirely certain would return. He stopped at the side of the wagon and looked up at Everett. "Boss," he said, simply, the word landing with a weight that had nothing to do with its size. Margaret heard it and went very still. Everett climbed down from the wagon. "Silas, how's everything running?" "Smooth," Silas said. "Heard you were due back this week." His eyes moved to Margaret. Quick, thorough, respectful in the way of a man who has spent 60 years learning to read people fast and accurately. Then back to Everett. "This her," he said. "This is Margaret Cole," Everett said. "My wife." Silas removed his hat. "Ma'am," he said, and the courtesy in it was not performed. It was the kind that simply exists in a person because it was put there early and has never left. "Welcome to Harlow." Margaret looked at him and then at the men behind him who had slowed their work without stopping it. 5 of them visible more. She could sense further back, all of them calibrating this moment with the careful attention of people who understood that what arrived with their employer today would shape the next considerable portion of their lives. "Thank you," she said, and meant it, though her voice came out quieter than she intended. Danny appeared at the back of the wagon, and Silas assessed him with immediate practical concern, the look of a man who does not waste time on sentiment when something more useful is called for. Boy needs the house, Silas said to Everett. Not a question. He's on the mend, but yes. Ruth will have a room ready in 20 minutes. He was already moving, already pulling one of the younger hands aside with a word that sent the man at a jog toward the house. The machinery of a well-run estate engaging without friction or discussion, simply because the person at the center of it had decided long ago what standards looked like and had built accordingly. Margaret stood in the yard and felt the full strangeness of her position for the first time since the Ridge. She was not needed here for practical survival. This place had been running efficiently for years without her. It would have continued to do so. The equation she had built in her head on the long ride north, the equation in which she would arrive somewhere modest and make herself useful and earn her place by contribution, that equation was wrong. She was not walking into need. She was walking into sufficiency, into something that already worked. She did not know yet if that was better or worse. Inside the house was more than she was prepared for. She had expected a rich man's interior, cold formal built for display. What she found instead was a house that had been lived in by people who worked. The floors were good hardwood but scuffed from years of boot traffic. The furniture was solid and expensive in the way that functional things are expensive, not decorative ones. Books on shelves that also held account ledgers and seed catalogs without apology. A stone fireplace large enough to heat a room the size of her entire rented house built that size, because the winters here required it and not for any other reason. It was the house of a man who had money and spent it on what mattered. Ruth Dern, who appeared from the kitchen as though she had been expecting them for hours and was simply waiting for them to arrive, was a compact woman of about 55 with iron gray hair and the air of someone who had been running this domestic operation for long enough that she no longer needed to think about most of it. She looked at Danny, once assessed him with the efficiency of a woman who has nursed sick people before and knows what she is looking at, and had him upstairs and fed and settled while Margaret was still standing in the front hallway, reorganizing her understanding of everything. Everett came in behind her and stood at a careful distance. The distance of a man who knows a storm is sitting in someone's chest and has enough sense not to walk into it. "I can show you around," he said, "when you're ready." Margaret turned to face him fully. The people here, Silas, Ruth, the workers in the yard. She paused. "How many Shah? 22 full-time. More during calving season. 22 people." She held his gaze. "And when you left for Millhaven, they all knew who you were and what you were doing." "Yes." "Did they know why the worn coat? The boots?" "Silas knew. He's known me since I was 12 years old." Everett's voice was even. "The others knew I'd gone looking, not the details. And 2 days ago you sent word ahead that we were coming." She said it without accusation, with the precision of a woman measuring something before she cuts it. "You were certain enough of my answer to send word ahead." "I was hopeful," he said. "There's a difference." He held her gaze. "If you had said no at the fence post, I would have walked away. I wouldn't have pushed. I wouldn't have tried to persuade you with any of this." A gesture that managed somehow to be dismissive of a mansion which, under different circumstances, might have made her want to laugh. "I've had someone change their mind when they saw this place. That is not something I wanted to go through again." The room was quiet around them. "Again," she said. "Her name was Eleanor Voss," he said. 3 years ago. I was honest with her from the beginning. Brought her out here." He paused. "She left 4 months later. Said she couldn't stand the isolation, that the estate felt like a prison." Another pause, smaller. "That I felt like a prison." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "I learned something from it," he said. "I learned that what I have here is not what everyone wants. And I learned that I didn't want to go through that again with someone who was in love with the idea of the estate instead of anything real." He looked at her steadily. "I needed to know if you would choose me when there was nothing to choose me for." She understood it then with a clarity that was almost uncomfortable. The worn coat and the cracked boots and the single gold coin on a counter were not manipulation. They were fear. The particular fear of a man who had been chosen for his wealth and left for his solitude, and had decided he would rather be chosen for nothing, and found worthy than chosen for everything, and found lacking. It did not make what he had done right, but it made it human. "I'm still angry with you," she said. "That's true, and it's going to take time before it isn't." He nodded. "That's fair." "Then we understand each other," she said. "Show me the house." He showed her the house. It took an hour, not because it was excessive, but because Margaret asked questions about everything. Who had built the fireplace? Which season the east wing had been added? What the small room off the kitchen had originally been used for, and whether it could be converted to a workroom with better light. That last question made him stop. "What would you use it for?" he said. "I sew," she said. "I need light in a stable surface, and a place where I can spread material without someone walking through it." He looked at the room, considering quietly. Windows, light direction, traffic patterns. "We'd have to move about 10 years of poorly organized storage," he said. "I've organized worse than storage," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was moving in that direction. "I expect you have," he said. They went through the kitchen, large and functional, and smelling of the bread Ruth had apparently started the moment she heard the wagon. Through the dining room, which was clearly used more often for spreading plans and maps and paperwork than for dining. Through Everett's study, which he opened and said simply, "This is mine, but you can use it whenever you need to." She kept that, remembered it. At the end of the tour, they stood on the back porch, long and covered, looking out over the valley in the last of the evening light. The scale of it was still arriving in Margaret in slow increments, each one larger than the last. The working buildings she now had names for. The people she now had faces for. The whole complex living organism of this place that had been running quietly in these mountains while the rest of the world assumed Everett Harlow was a drifter with nothing. "Questions," he said. "Several hundred," she said. "I'll pace them." He almost smiled again. She looked out at the valley, then the sewing room, the storage room off the kitchen. "I want to start clearing it this week. I'll have Silas organize the men to move it." "I'll do it myself," she said, "with whoever wants to help. I don't need it done for me." He looked at her. "All right. And I want to see the account books." He was quiet for just a moment. "Tonight, tomorrow morning," she said. "First thing." He nodded. They stood in silence for a moment, and the valley sounds came up around them. Cattle settling the last calls of the working day from the barn, and somewhere inside the house, Danny's voice asking Ruth something, and Ruth's calm response. "Why Millhaven?" Margaret said. "You said you went to 3 towns before. Why Millhaven specifically?" He was quiet for a moment. "I'd been to Crestwood first, then Harmon's Crossing." He looked at the mountains on the far side of the valley. "In Millhaven, I watched a woman tell Dorothy Haynes to mind her own business, without raising her voice or turning around." He glanced at her. "And then I watched her drive a harder bargain than most men I've done business with in 20 years. Margaret stared at him. He was completely serious. "Those were your conditions," he said. "Partnership. Your brother covered. A real voice." He paused. "You walked in with nothing and negotiated like you had everything. I wanted to know the woman who could do that." Margaret looked away back at the valley. Her chest was doing something she was not ready to examine. "You're still in trouble with me," she said. "I know. Good night, Everett." "Good night, Margaret." She went inside. He stayed on the porch after she left, looking out at the valley going dark around him. He stayed there with the feeling of a man who has carried something carefully for a very long time and has been permitted to set it down for a moment, but is not yet certain whether what comes next will be easier or harder than what came before. Morning on the Harlow estate came at 5 o'clock, announced by the sounds of horses and cattle and men calling across the yard, and the ring of the smithy starting up with the cheerful indifference of a place that does not slow its schedule for new arrivals. Margaret was dressed and downstairs by 5:15. Ruth was in the kitchen. She looked at Margaret when she came through the door, and something in her expression shifted a small revision upward, of something she had been estimating, and it told Margaret something about the previous visitors to this house. None of them, she suspected, had been in the kitchen at 5:15. "Can I help?" Margaret said. Ruth looked at her for a moment. Then she handed her a bowl and pointed at the flour bin without a word. They worked together in the easy quiet of two practical women who have no need to fill every moment with conversation. By 6 o'clock, Margaret had learned that Ruth had been on this estate for 16 years, that she had known Everett since he was a young man first taking on his father's responsibilities, and that she expressed opinions about people through implication rather than statement, which was more efficient and considerably more accurate. "He's a good man," Ruth said once, not looking up from the biscuits she was cutting. "I don't doubt it," Margaret said carefully. "Doesn't always show it the right way." "No, Mom," Margaret agreed. "He doesn't." Ruth glanced at her sideways. Eleanor Voss wanted a different life. He offered this one honestly, and she left. She set down her cutter. Maybe she was right to. Maybe it was too much to ask of her, but it wasn't nothing to ask of him either. Margaret said nothing. She let that sit and kept working. She found Everett in the study after breakfast, the account ledgers already spread across the desk waiting. He had not needed to ask which ones. He had known she meant all of them. She sat down across from him and opened the first ledger and began to read. What she found in those pages surprised her, not because the numbers were bad, but because of how specifically good they were. Worker wages ran higher than regional standards, not extravagantly, but meaningfully, the difference between a man who could save a little and a man who could not. The estate spent heavily on medical supplies, on food stores laid in before winter, on equipment maintenance that prevented the larger costs of failure. There was a line item for a school primer order placed each spring that she did not ask about yet but made a note of. And then there were 3 recurring quarterly payments to 3 different names. Logged simply as old agreements, she pointed to them. These. Everett looked at the entries. Something in his expression became careful. Commitments my father made when he was expanding the land. Some families sold him acreage they'd been working. In exchange, Nathaniel promised quarterly payments for as long as the estate operated. Are they still farming? The Grady family runs their own small spread on the east side. The second family moved to Helena years ago. The third, he paused. Edna Briggs. Her husband Harold sold land to my father in 1853. Harold passed in 1875. Edna has been receiving those payments since before I took over. Margaret looked at the ledger. At the absolute consistency of those payments, year after year, never missed, never reduced. Your father made these promises, she said. Not you. You could have found legal grounds to end them when the estate transferred. They were promised, he said, as if this were self-evident. She looked at him. Most men would have found a reason. He said nothing. Margaret looked back down at the ledger and felt something shift in her understanding of the man across the desk. Not the understanding of his wealth, which she was still processing in increments. The understanding of his character, of what he actually was beneath the estate, in the worn coat, in the fear that had sent him to Millhaven with a gold coin and a plain question. She was still angry with him. That remained true. But she was beginning to understand the shape of what she had agreed to in a way she had not been able to see from the fence post at the north end of Millhaven. Danny was better by the third day. Not well, not yet, but measurably better color returning to his face, and an appetite that had Ruth shaking her head in mock alarm at how much one thin boy could consume. He moved carefully, conserved himself, but his eyes were sharp again, and he watched everything about the estate with the focused cataloging attention of someone storing information they intended to use. On the fourth morning, Margaret watched from the yard as Danny found Silas in the barn. She could see them clearly, her 16-year-old brother beside the 62-year-old foreman, both of them examining a harness laid out on the workbench. Danny was asking questions in that rapid-fire way of his, while Silas answered in steady, unhurried sentences, the way a man answers when he has found a student worth teaching. Everett came up beside her. Your brother has opinions about harness construction, he said. Danny has opinions about everything. Silas says he's right about the stitching on the shoulder plate. Margaret kept her eyes on the barn. That's not nothing. No, Everett said. It's not. A pause. He reminds me of my father, the way he asks questions and then actually listens to the answers, like he's building something in his head while you talk. Margaret looked at him. Nathaniel started this estate with 40 acres and one hired hand, Everett said. He didn't inherit anything. He built it from what he knew and what he was willing to learn. A pause. Danny started with less than that. Margaret looked back at the barn, at her brother who was now demonstrating something about stitch spacing to a man who had been working leather since before Danny was born, and Silas was nodding along with the seriousness the observation deserved. She did not say anything. Some things did not need saying. It was on the 5th day that Victor Crane rode in. Margaret saw him from the east pasture fence where she had been watching 2 of the hands work a young horse through its paces. She heard the horse before she saw the rider, a sound that was different from the estate's usual traffic, and she turned and saw a man she did not recognize coming through the main gate at an easy trot that suggested someone who considered themselves entitled to easy trots through other people's gates. He was somewhere around 50, well-fed, in a way that spoke of consistent plenty with silver at his temples, and the assembled handsomeness of a man who had worked at his appearance long enough that it no longer looked like work. He sat his horse with the ease of someone who had grown up on horseback, and he looked around the yard with the proprietary interest of someone cataloging an inventory they are considering acquiring. Then he saw Margaret, and something changed in his expression. A recalculation. A new piece of information being slotted into whatever plan he was already running. Silas appeared at her shoulder before the man had even dismounted. She had not heard him approach. Victor Crane, Silas said, his voice flat and deliberate. He's been circling the south boundary for 2 months. Who is he? Owns 2 ranches east of the Grady land. He wants the valley. A pause. He's been wanting it for 10 years. What stopped him? Everett, Silas said simply. Crane dismounted in the yard with the ease of a man making himself at home in a space that is not his. He looked around once more, taking in the barns and the house and the yard, and then his eyes found Margaret again, and he crossed toward her with his hand extended and a smile that showed a great number of teeth. Mrs. Harlow, he said, I'd heard Everett had finally gotten himself a wife. I confess I didn't believe it. He took her hand with a grip that was practiced and confident. Victor Crane, an old friend of the estate. Margaret shook his hand. Mr. Crane. She released it at exactly the right moment, not early, not late. Is Everett expecting you? Oh, I was just passing through, he said with the ease of a man who has never just passed through anything in his life. Thought I'd pay my respects. Welcome the new Mrs. Harlow to the valley. How kind, Margaret said. I'll let him know you're here. She went inside and found Everett in the study. Victor Crane is in the yard, she said. The change in Everett was immediate and total. Whatever ease had been building in him over the past several days contracted into something alert and flat and very still, the way a landscape changes when the weather shifts, and you realize the light has been wrong for some time without knowing why. What does he want? Everett said. He didn't say. He said he was passing through. Everett stood up. He's never passing through. He moved toward the door, then paused and looked at her. Stay inside. Why? Because Crane is the kind of trouble that gets worse when it has more to work with. A pause. Please. She looked at him for a moment, then she went to the study window instead. She could see them clearly. Everett crossing the yard with that deliberate, unhurried stride of his. Crane turning toward him with the assembled smile, his hands moving, as he talked the expansive gestures of a man making an offer. Everett was still arms loose at his sides, and she could read from 30 yards away that his body had said no before Crane had finished speaking. Crane reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He held it out. Everett looked at it but did not take it. Then Everett said something, and Crane's smile did something small and complex. Not disappearing exactly, but adjusting, tightening at the edges into the smile of a man who has shifted from offering to threatening without letting the surface change. He put the document back in his coat. He tipped his hat. He got back on his horse and rode out through the gate at the same easy trot he had ridden in on, and the gate swung shut behind him, and Everett stood in the yard for a long moment watching the south road. Then he came inside. He came directly to the study and found Margaret still at the window. He did not tell her she shouldn't have been watching. "Well," she said. He sat down, looked at his desk for a moment. "He's made a legal claim on the south pasture, 40 acres. Says there's a boundary dispute going back to my father's original land agreement." He paused. "He's been building this case for at least 2 years. He had a private survey done in 1880. He's claiming our south boundary was filed incorrectly in 1847 and that the true line sits 40 yards north of where Nathaniel registered it. What's his evidence?" Everett opened the desk drawer and placed a document on the surface between them. A signed witness statement from Harold Briggs, attesting that the original 1847 survey placed the boundary 40 yards north of where Nathaniel filed. Margaret was very still. "Harold Briggs," she said. "Who died in 1875? "Yes." She picked up the document, read it carefully, read it again. The signature at the bottom was clear and firm, the signature of a man who had written his name with confidence. "Can he win?" she said. Everett looked at her steadily. "I don't know. That's the problem." She set the document down with precise care, the kind of care that conceals a very controlled anger. "When did you first find out about this claim?" 2 months ago, when Crane sent his surveyor to walk the south fence line. 2 months ago. She looked at him. "And you went to Mill Haven 3 weeks ago." "I thought it could wait," he said. The honesty of it, the willingness to state the mistake plainly, was something she was coming to recognize as characteristic of him. "It cannot wait," she said. "I know that now." She pulled the document back toward her and began reading it a third time. Her hands were steady. Her mind was moving faster than her hands. "Crane is not going to file immediately," she said. "He came here today to give you the option to settle. That means he's not entirely confident." She looked up. If he were confident, he would have filed already and sent a letter. He came in person because he wanted to see what he was dealing with. "And what did he see?" Everett said. "He saw me," Margaret said. "And he recalculated." Everett looked at her. "He didn't know you'd come back with a wife," she said. "He was expecting to deal with you alone. A man alone is a simpler problem." She tapped the document. "This claim is built on a dead man's signature. Harold Briggs died in 1875. Whatever this document says, there is exactly one person still living who would know whether Harold Briggs actually signed it or not." Everett was very still. "Edna Briggs," he said. "She's still in Mill Haven," Margaret said. "I know her, not well, but I know her well enough to know that Harold Briggs was a precise man. He kept records. He was careful about what he put his name to." She looked at Everett. "If he signed this, Edna will know. And if he didn't, Edna will know that too." Everett leaned forward, both forearms on the desk. "She'll talk to you." "I think so. She won't talk to you. Not about this. But she'll talk to me." Margaret paused. "We need to go back to Mill Haven. We only just—" "I know," she said. "And Crane knows we're here and knows what we found when we arrived and is counting on us needing time to settle before we move." She held his gaze. "We don't give him that time." The silence in the room was the silence of something being decided. Then Silas appeared in the doorway, and something in the way he stood there, the specific stillness of a man who has information he does not want to deliver, made both of them look up at the same moment. "What is it?" Everett said. Silas came into the room. He stood with his arms crossed, and his expression doing the careful work of a man who is not surprised but is deeply, thoroughly unhappy. "Peters," he said. "Crane's land agent, the one who walked the south line 2 months ago." He paused. "He was here today, while you were meeting with Crane in the yard. He came in through the east gate, said he had questions about a fence marker on the northeast corner. Young Aldridge let him in. Aldridge has been here 8 months. He doesn't know Peter's face. Margaret felt the cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. How long was he here? Everett said. Better part of an hour. Talked to 3 of the hands, walked the south end of the yard, looked at the bunkhouse. Silas's jaw was tight. Asked questions about staffing, about changes since you got back. He was building a picture, Margaret said. Both men looked at her. Crane sent him. Not about the fence marker. He wanted to know what had changed since you left. Whether I was here. What resources were in play. She looked at Everett. Crane saw you walk out to meet him and saw me at the window and revised his estimate of what he was dealing with. He sent Peters through the east gate to gather information while he had your attention in the front yard. She paused. The meeting in the yard was a distraction. The room was very quiet. He's going to move faster than 30 days, Silas said. Yes, Margaret said. He is. Everett looked at her. At the steadiness in her face and the specific focused quality of her attention and the way she had just mapped Crane's strategy as calmly as if she were reading a pattern laid out on a work table. We leave for Millhaven tomorrow morning, Margaret said. I'll go to Edna Briggs myself. You'll come with me, but you'll wait outside. Let me go in alone. She paused. And we need a lawyer in Helena. Not for later, now. Someone who can file a response before Crane files a claim. I know a man in Helena, Everett said. Edward Marsh. He handled my father's estate transfer. Send word tonight. Tell him we're coming within the week. She stood up. Crane has been building this for 2 years. He has a private survey and a dead man's signature and a 30-year grudge. She looked at Everett directly. He chose his moment carefully. He waited until you left the estate and then he moved. A pause. He did not plan for you to come back with someone who reads account ledgers. Everett looked at her for a long moment. No, he said quietly. He didn't. That night, Margaret sat alone at the desk, long after the house had gone quiet. The documents were spread in front of her, the witness statement, the quarterly payment records, the original land agreement from 1853 that outlined the boundaries of the Harlow estate purchase. She was looking for the thing she was missing, because there was always a thing you were missing, and the thing you didn't see was always the thing that mattered most. She was still reading when Everett's footsteps came down the hall and stopped at the study door. He came in and saw the lamp still burning and the documents in her. You should sleep, he said. In a while. She tapped the land agreement. Your father's original filing. What was his relationship with Crane's family? Everett came around to her side of the desk and looked at the document. Nathaniel and Crane's father, Douglas, were business partners before I was born. 1853. They built the first road through the South Pass together. Shared the cost. Shared the contract. He paused. When the territorial government paid out for the road, Douglas Crane claimed he hadn't received his full share. There was a dispute. It was settled legally in Nathaniel's favor. And Victor Crane grew up believing his family was cheated, Margaret said. Yes. Was his father right? Everett held her gaze, steady and direct. I don't know, he said. I was not born yet. I have Nathaniel's records, and they show a clean settlement. But I wasn't there, and fair men make mistakes. He paused. My father was a fair man. I believe that. But I can't tell you with certainty what happened in 1853. Margaret sat with the honesty of that for a moment. A man who could say that about his own father, who could hold the possibility of imperfection without letting it collapse the whole structure of his belief, was a particular kind of man. This explains why Crane didn't try to challenge the boundary in your father's time, she said. He was building, waiting, making sure he had something solid enough to win with. She looked at the document. Harold Briggs was the original survey witness in 1847. Crane's plan required Harold's testimony. Harold died in 1875, which should have ended the plan. But instead, Crane found a way to produce Harold's signature anyway. She looked up. That means someone either forged the signature or pressured Harold before he died, or obtained a signature under false pretenses. Which one? Everett said. I don't know yet, Margaret said. That's what Edna Briggs will tell us. She looked back at the document. Outside the study window, the valley was dark and enormous and perfectly still. The mountains on three sides holding it the way they had always held it, unchanged by any of this, indifferent to boundary disputes and legal claims and 30-year grudges, simply there, simply solid, simply enduring. Margaret thought about the quarterly payments to Edna Briggs continued without interruption for nearly 30 years. She thought about a man who had given those payments every quarter because they were promised, not because the law required it, and who had gone to 3 towns in worn boots because he was afraid of being chosen for the wrong reasons, and who had said, "We'll take care of each other," to a sick boy he had never met without a moment's hesitation. She looked at the study window and the dark valley beyond it and felt something settle in her chest that was not forgiveness exactly, and was not quite love yet, but was something real and substantial, and pointing in a direction she was beginning to recognize. She had come north with nothing but 3 conditions and a coin she had not asked for. She was beginning to understand that she had arrived at something that was going to ask considerably more of her than she had anticipated, and that she was not, when she examined herself honestly, afraid of that. She was something closer to ready. "Go to sleep," she said. "We have a long ride tomorrow." Everett looked at her for a moment, at the lamp and the documents, and her hands still resting on the pages of a land agreement that was older than either of them. "Margaret," he said. She looked up. He seemed to think about what he wanted to say and then decide against all of it. "Thank you," he said instead. Simple, plain. The same way he had said it at the north end of Millhaven when she had agreed to come, as if gratitude were something he meant too much to decorate. She looked back at the documents. "Good night, Everett." He left. The house settled around her, and Margaret Cole sat in the study of a house she had not known existed a week ago, reading the records of a man she had married for 3 conditions and a gold coin, and understood that whatever was coming next, she was going to meet it with both hands open and her eyes clear. That was the only way she had ever known how to do anything. They left before sunrise. Ruth had provisions packed and waiting at the door before either of them came downstairs, enough for 4 days, organized with the efficiency of a woman who had been running a working household for 16 years and did not require instruction. She pressed her hand briefly to Margaret's arm as she passed and said nothing, and that said everything it needed to say. Danny was awake to see them off. He stood in the doorway in his coat, still thin, but standing straight with Silas beside him, like a wall that had developed the capacity for quiet opinion. Danny looked at Margaret's face, and then at Everett's, and did the rapid, silent calculation he had been doing with people's faces since he was small. "You're going back to Millhaven," he said. "We need to speak with Edna Briggs," Margaret said. "About the claim." "Yes." Danny looked at Everett with that level gaze of his, the one that had been making people recalibrate since he was 12 years old. "Take care of her." "We'll take care of each other," Everett said. Danny recognized the words. Margaret could see it in the small shift of his expression, the almost invisible adjustment of someone filing something away for later consideration. He stepped back from the doorway. Silas put a hand briefly on Everett's shoulder, wordless, the gesture of a man who has watched this person grow from a boy into someone worth standing beside. And then they were moving, the wagon rolling out through the gate into the dark mountain morning, and the estate fell away behind them. The road south felt different from the road north. Margaret noticed it in her own body before she named it. Going north, she had been a woman moving toward an unknown, carrying uncertainty like weather she could not see past. Coming south, she was something else. A woman who knew what she was going back to face, what she was defending, what was at stake. She had read the account ledgers. She had seen the quarterly payments. She had stood in the study at midnight with a dead man's disputed signature on a document in front of her, and found that her mind moved clearly and purposefully in the presence of a problem that had a shape. She was not the woman who had left Millhaven 6 days ago. She was not certain Millhaven would notice. But she noticed. Everett drove without speaking for the first hour. The morning was cold, and the road was firm, and the horses moved at the steady ground-covering pace of animals that understood distance. Margaret watched the mountains diminish behind them as they descended toward the lower country and thought about Edna Briggs. She had known Edna the way you know people in a small town, well enough to nod to not well enough to sit with. Harold Briggs had been a land surveyor's witness for most of his working life, the kind of steady, reliable man that a town like Millhaven produced in reasonable numbers and did not sufficiently appreciate. He had been precise. That was the word people used about Harold. He was a precise man. He kept records. He was careful about what he attached his name to. Edna had been shaped by 30 years beside a man like that. Precision was not just his quality, it had become the household's quality. "She won't warm up to the situation quickly," Margaret said when they were 2 hours out. "Edna Briggs does not make decisions quickly. She makes them correctly. There's a difference." "What does that mean for how we approach her?" "It means I go in alone and I don't push." Margaret looked at the road ahead. "I tell her the truth and I step back and I let her get there herself. The moment she feels managed, she'll close." Everett was quiet for a moment. "You've been thinking about this since yesterday." "I've been thinking about this since I read that witness statement," she said. "Harold Briggs was precise. If he signed that document willingly, Edna will know about it, and she'll say so. And if he didn't, Edna will know that too." She paused. "Either way, she's the only person alive who can tell us which it is." They were quiet for a while. The country opened up around them as they descended the heavy timber, giving way to rolling pasture, the mountains still visible behind them, but growing distant. "Tell me about your father," Margaret said. "What he was actually like." Everett looked at her sideways. "Not the estate version," she said. "The version you know." He was quiet for a moment. Then he talked. Really talked in a way she had not heard from him yet, about a man who had come to Montana with a horse and a hand tool, and a certainty that was apparently geological in its stubbornness. Who had negotiated land purchases with handshakes and then honored every one of them when the paperwork caught up months later? Who had built the estate piece by piece over 30 years, not with inherited money, but with compounded patience, with the kind of slow, certain work that does not make for exciting stories, but builds things that last 3 generations if tended correctly? Who had told Everett when Everett was 15 and impatient and convinced that everything worth doing should show results inside a season, that the most important things a man builds are invisible for a long time before they become visible, and that the temptation to rush that process is the thing that destroys most of what men attempt? Who had died of a heart that wore out from working too hard for too long, with too little complaint in the winter of 1880, and had left behind an estate and a name and a set of obligations that Everett had honored without being asked to? "He never announced what he had," Everett said near the end. "He let the work speak. He used to say that a man who has to tell you he's worth something usually isn't." Margaret thought about a worn coat and cracked boots and a gold coin placed on a counter with deliberate care. "You got that from him," she said. "For better and worse," he said. "Both," she said. "Honestly, both." And she let him see that she meant the criticism and the understanding in the same look, because that was the truth, and she was not in the habit of softening the truth into something easier to hold. He looked back at the road, but something in him eased slightly, the easing of a man who has been carrying something carefully and has been told he can rest it for a moment without it breaking. Millhaven looked smaller. That was the first thing Margaret noticed when the wagon rolled down the main street. The buildings were the same. The distances were the same. But the scale of it had changed against what she was carrying now, against the mountains she had come from, and the valley she had come to know, and the specific size of what was at stake. The town looked like what it was, a modest collection of wooden buildings on a dirt street, doing its modest best in a territory that was still deciding what it wanted to be. The second thing she noticed was the way people looked at her. It was different from how they had looked at her a week ago. She felt it the moment the wagon rolled past the mercantile, the eyes that came to windows, the woman who stopped on the boardwalk and stared openly. Old Mr. Farrow came to the doorway and lifted a hand with something that looked genuinely like relief. The word had traveled. The poor seamstress who had married the nobody drifter had gone north and had not come back starving. That was already more than most of them had predicted. Edna Briggs lived on the west side of town, in a house that was small and exactly maintained the house of a woman who had made a decision after her husband died about what her life was going to look like and had held that shape ever since. The garden was put to bed for winter with the precision of someone who takes the task seriously. The porch had been swept recently. The curtains in the front window were straight. Everett tied the horse 2 houses down without being asked to. Margaret walked to the door alone. She knocked and waited, and after a moment the door opened and Edna Briggs looked at her with the expression of a woman who is not accustomed to being surprised and is taking a moment to adjust to the fact that she currently is. "Margaret Cole," Edna said. "Mrs. Briggs." Margaret paused. "Harlow now." Edna looked at her for a moment. Then she stepped back from the door. The inside of Edna's house was what Margaret had expected. Precise and clean and organized with the thoroughness of someone who finds comfort in the knowledge that everything is exactly where she put it. A place for everything. Everything in its place, the household of a woman who had lived alone for 8 years and had made a kind of peace with that life that did not require disruption to be valid. They sat in the front room. Edna did not offer tea. "I heard you'd gone north," Edna said, "with the Harlow man." "I did," Margaret said. "I came back because I need to ask you something about Harold." Edna went very still, the stillness of someone who has been expecting a conversation and has been waiting to find out which version of it they were going to be required to have. "Harold has been gone 8 years, she said. "I know, and I'm sorry for that, Edna. I mean it genuinely." Margaret held the older woman's gaze. "Before he died, someone came to see him. A man who said he was doing historical research on early Montana territory surveys. He spent time with Harold and then asked him to sign a document about the Harlow South Boundary Survey from 1847. She paused. Harold witnessed that survey. The man wanted a statement confirming certain details about where the boundary line was placed. The stillness in the room deepened. "What did Harold tell you about that visit?" Margaret said. Edna looked at the window. At something outside it, or perhaps not outside it at all. Perhaps it's something considerably further away than the street beyond the glass. "He told me," she said slowly, "that a man came to the house in the fall of 1874. Very polite. Said he was compiling a record of early territorial surveys, wanted to speak with men who had been there when the work was done." She paused. "Harold enjoyed it. He liked talking about that work. He'd been a witness for 20 years, and he kept good records of everything, every survey, every boundary, every mark and measurement. He was proud of those records." "What happened when the man asked him to sign?" Edna's jaw set in a way that Margaret recognized as the jaw of a woman who has been carrying something for a long time and has just been given permission to put it down. "Harold said no," she said. The room was very quiet. "He came home that evening, and he told me that the man had asked him to confirm something that was not what Harold remembered. He said the man wanted a statement that the Harlow South boundary had been surveyed 40 yards north of where it was filed." Edna looked at Margaret directly. "Harold said that was not true. He said he had been at that survey in 1847. He had watched Nathaniel Harlow's surveyor do the work. He had witnessed the measurements himself, and the boundary was placed exactly where it was filed." She paused. "He said he would not sign his name to something that was not true. Not for anyone. Not for any amount of money." "Did the man offer money?" Margaret said. "He did," Edna said. "Harold refused that too." Margaret sat with that for a moment. "What happened after that visit?" "Harold was unsettled by it for a few days. Then he let it go. He said he'd done the right thing, and that was the end of it." Edna's voice was steady and very precise. "He died the following spring, April of 1875. "And after he died," Margaret said carefully, "did anyone come to the house?" The brightness that appeared in Edna's eyes then was not grief exactly, though grief was part of it. It was the brightness of a woman who has spent 8 years knowing something was wrong and not having the shape of it clearly enough to speak. About a month after Harold passed, she said that same man came back, said he wanted to return some materials he'd borrowed from Harold's files and pay his respects. He spent an hour helping me sort through Harold's things. She stopped. He was very kind about it, very helpful. Margaret waited. About 6 months later, Edna said I was going through Harold's record books. He kept them on the shelf in his office, every survey he'd witnessed going back 30 years, every entry in his own hand. She paused. One page was missing, from the entry for the 1847 Harlow South Boundary Survey. Harold's notes on what he observed that day, the measurements, his own record of where the boundary was placed. She looked at Margaret. I thought I had misplaced it. I looked for it for months. I never found it. You didn't misplace it, Margaret said. No, Edna said. I have understood that for some time. She folded her hands in her lap with the deliberate composure of someone who has decided what they are going to do and is simply waiting for the moment to arrive. Victor Crane sent that man. Yes, Margaret said. I believe he did. And now Crane has produced a document with Harold's signature on it. Yes. Edna was quiet for a moment. Harold did not sign that document, she said. Whatever signature is on it was not given by my husband with his knowledge and his willing hand. Harold Briggs was a precise man. He told me explicitly that he refused. I knew my husband for 31 years. I know what he was capable of, and I know what he was not capable of. She paused. He was not capable of signing his name to something he knew to be false. Then Edna stood. She went into the back room without a word, and Margaret heard the sound of a drawer opening. When Edna returned, she was carrying a small brown envelope worn at the edges, the kind of envelope that has been handled many times and set aside many times and never opened. She held it out to Margaret. Harold gave me this before he passed, Edna said. He said to me, if anyone ever comes asking about the Harlow South Boundary Survey, give them this. He said it in the way he said serious things, looking straight at me, making sure I understood he meant it. Margaret took the envelope. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single folded sheet in Harold Briggs's own handwriting, the same precise hand she had seen described in account ledgers and imagined from everything Edna had told her. At the top, a date, November 1874. Below that, a careful record of the coordinates of the Harlow South boundary bearing marks and reference points, written with the thoroughness of a man who had spent 2 decades making records that others would rely on. And at the bottom, signed in full, a single line that was simple and exact and left nothing uncertain. This line is correct. I witnessed it placed. I will not sign anything that says otherwise. Harold Briggs had known. He had understood in November of 1874 that someone was going to try to use his name against the truth, and he had taken the only measure available to him. He had written down what he knew in his own hand and signed it and given it to his wife and told her to wait. He had been waiting 8 years in that envelope for the right person to come and ask the right question. Margaret sat very still for a moment. She felt something in her chest that was not sentiment and was not strategy, but was somewhere between the two. The particular feeling of finding something you needed so badly, you had not let yourself believe it still existed. He knew, she said quietly. Harold always knew, Edna said. He was a precise man. Margaret looked at her. Edna, would you be willing to testify at a hearing in Helena to tell them what Harold told you and to present this document? The silence that followed was long enough to breathe in. Edna Briggs looked at Margaret Cole Harlow, and Margaret looked back at her, and neither of them looked away. Victor Crane used my husband's name, Edna said finally. He waited until Harold was gone and used his name to steal land from people Harold had spent his life working honestly alongside. She straightened in her chair with the posture of a woman who has made a decision and intends to wear it. I will not sit in this town and allow that. Yes, I will testify. They were back on the wagon within the hour. Margaret held the leather satchel in her lap with Harold Briggs' envelope inside it and felt the particular quality of having done something that mattered. She'll hold, Margaret said. She's made up her mind. What did she give you? Everett said, looking at the satchel. Margaret told him. She told him everything Edna had said, And then she told him about the envelope and what was written inside it. And when she finished, Everett drove in silence for a long moment. He prepared for this, Everett said finally, before he died. He knew what was being attempted, Margaret said. He just didn't know whether anyone would come looking. She looked at the road ahead. Crane didn't account for a man precise enough to prepare for the possibility that he might be proven wrong after he was gone. Everett was quiet for another moment. Crane underestimated him. Crane underestimated what a precise man leaves behind, Margaret said, and what a precise woman keeps. She was about to say something more when Everett reached into his coat and produced a folded newspaper page. He handed it to her without a word. She unfolded it, read it. It was from the Helena Territorial Courier dated 2 days ago. The article was short and placed where short articles go when someone has paid for their placement rather than earned it. It described a rancher from the North Valley who had recently taken a wife in the town of Millhaven under questionable circumstances, having concealed his true identity and wealth from the woman and from the community. The word deceptive appeared twice. The phrase pattern of dishonesty appeared once. Victor Crane's name was not in the article. It did not need to be. Margaret read it through twice. Then she folded it carefully and handed it back. "He's trying to establish your character before the hearing," she said. "Yes. He wants a judge to already have doubts about your honesty before you walk into the room." "Yes?" She looked at him, at the stillness of his profile, the set of his jaw, the quality of his silence. She understood what this cost him. Not his reputation in the abstract, his specific deepest fear made public. The thing he had gone to 3 towns in worn boots to avoid being. Chosen for the wrong reasons, defined by the wrong thing, reduced to a story that was not the true story. "Everett," she said. He looked at her. "Let him tell it," she said. He was quiet. "Let him put that story in front of a judge," she said. "Because when that judge looks across the room and sees me sitting beside you, the story becomes something else. It becomes a man who valued honesty enough to risk looking like nothing to find it." She held his gaze. "That is not a liability. That is character. Let Crane try to make it into something else." Everett looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked back at the road, and something in him that had been braced came slightly undone the way a rope comes undone when you find the right knot. "You're right," he said. "I know," she said, and then more quietly, "It's a good story, Everett. It's the true one. Those are not always the same thing, but in this case they are." He said nothing, but his hands on the reins changed some tension, leaving them that had been there since he pulled the paper from his coat. Helena arrived on the morning of the 3rd day like cold water after a long ride. The noise and density of it, the energy of a territorial capital that is always in the middle of deciding what it wants to become. After nearly 2 weeks at the estate, Margaret had forgotten what a city felt like. The press of people, the commerce and argument and motion. They went directly to the territorial land office. It occupied the ground floor of a stone building on the main street and smelled the way all archives smell: old paper and ink, and the dry, particular mustiness of documents that have outlasted the urgency that created them. A young clerk with careful eyes and ink-stained fingers looked up when they came in. Everett placed his card on the counter. "I need access to the original survey archive, field notes from the 1847 boundary surveys in the Harlow Valley District." The clerk looked at the card, looked up. "Some of those records were damaged in the 1875 fire." "I know," Everett said. "I need to know what survived." The clerk hesitated. Margaret put her hand flat on the counter. Not aggressively, simply present with the calm authority of a woman who has made a decision about how this conversation is going to go. "This is an active legal dispute," she said. "We've ridden 3 days from the North Valley. We would appreciate your efficiency." The clerk looked at her, made a rapid internal calculation. "Give me 30 minutes, he said. The wait stretched to nearly an hour. They sat on a bench in the hallway. Everett sat with his forearms on his knees. Margaret sat straight, watching the door. "If it's gone," he said quietly. "It's not gone," she said. "You don't know that. No, but sitting here preparing for what we can't control helps no one. She looked at him. If it's gone, we find another way. But it hasn't gone yet. He nodded once and looked back at the door. The clerk returned carrying a flat document box with the careful movements of a man who has realized he is holding something significant. Survey Field Notes, 1847 Harlow Valley District. He said, they survived. Northern storage room. The fire didn't reach it. He set the box on the counter with the reverence of someone who has just understood what they are handling. Last accessed, he checked the log on the outside of the box 19 years ago. Everett's hands were steady as he lifted the lid. The field notes were in the handwriting of a working surveyor who wrote for function rather than display. No flourishes, no performance, just measurements and bearing marks and reference points, recorded with the precision of a man who understood that what he wrote down was going to matter for a very long time, and wrote accordingly. Everett found the south boundary entry. His finger went to the coordinate line. He read it again, looked up at Margaret. She had already read it. The number was clear. The bearing was exact. The south boundary of the Harlow estate was precisely where Nathaniel had filed it in 1847. Not 40 yards north, not a foot north. Exactly where it had always been, where Harold Briggs had witnessed it being placed, where every season of work and maintenance and cattle and fence line had confirmed its standing. It's here, Everett said. His voice was level, but something underneath the levelness was not level at all. Something that was a man who has been holding his father's name in his hands through this entire journey and has just been told the name is clean. All of it, Margaret said. She turned to the clerk. We need certified copies of every page relating to the Harlow south boundary. Today. Yes, ma'am, the clerk said, and reached for his stamp without hesitation. From the land office, they went to Edward Marsh. His office was on the second floor above the bank, reached by a staircase that had been built to last. Marsh himself was a thin man of about 60, with a desk so organized it communicated something about the quality of the mind behind it, and an expression that suggested he had been listening to arguments for 30 years and had developed a finely calibrated sense of which ones were worth his time. He looked up when they came in. He looked at the certified field notes Everett placed on his desk. He read them with the stillness of a man who is very good at not showing what he is thinking, and then he sat back in his chair and something in his posture changed. This is straightforward, he said. Tell me, Everett said. Crane's private survey contradicts a 40-year-old government record. His witness statement, authentic or not, contradicts the same record. A judge is going to look at these field notes from 1847 and look at Crane's survey from 1880 and ask one question. He folded his hands. Why should I trust a privately commissioned survey over a government record from the original filing? Crane has no good answer for that. He'll argue the original survey was wrong, Margaret said. Marsh looked at her with the attentive precision of a man revising his understanding of the meeting. Yes, and opposing counsel will note that if the original survey was wrong, the error went unchallenged for 40 years, that no complaint was filed at the time, and that the only person who has ever claimed it was wrong is the man who stands to profit from that claim. He paused. Do you have anything on the witness statement? Edna Briggs, Margaret said. Harold Briggs's widow. She'll testify that Harold told her explicitly he refused to sign any statement about the Harlow south boundary, that a man visited him in 1874 and offered money for a statement Harold said was not true, and Harold refused. She paused. And that the same man returned after Harold died and left with a page from Harold's survey records that has not been seen since. She opened the satchel and placed Harold's envelope on the desk. And Harold prepared this before he died, in his own hand. Signed and dated November 1874. The coordinates of the Harlow south boundary exactly as he witnessed them in 1847, with a statement that he would not sign anything contradicting them. Marsh was very still for a long moment. You have a document in the deceased witness's own hand contradicting the statement Crane has produced, he said. Yes. Then this is not a boundary dispute. He said it quietly with the weight of a man who understands exactly what that means. This is fraud. File an injunction, Everett said. Stop Crane from filing his claim until this can be heard properly. I'll have it drafted by this afternoon. Marsh was already pulling paper toward him. He paused. Crane has hired Thomas Webb. The room went quiet. How do you know that? Everett said. Webb sent a letter to my office 2 days ago. Professional courtesy. Marsh set down his pen. Webb is the most expensive land attorney in the territory. Crane is spending considerably more on this case than the land is worth in straightforward terms. He looked at both of them. That tells you something about what this is actually about. He's scared, Margaret said. Both men looked at her. Nobody hires Thomas Webb unless they need to win badly enough to pay anything. Crane knows the field notes destroy his survey. He knows Edna Briggs is going to testify. He knows now that Harold left written documentation of his refusal. He hired Webb because he believes enough money and enough pressure can still overcome all of that. She looked at Marsh. Can it? Not if we're in that room, Marsh said. They found Clement Row that same afternoon. The offices of the Helena Territorial Record were 2 streets from Marsh's building, announced from half a block away by the smell of ink and the sound of a press in operation. Rowe himself was a large man of 65 with white hair and the look of someone who has spent 40 years deciding what mattered and had gotten very fast at it. He came out from the back when his assistant told him Everett Harlow was in the office, and he took one look at Everett and one look at Margaret and said, "You found her." "I did," Everett said. Rowe turned to Margaret. "Clement Rowe. I knew his father." "I gathered," Margaret said. Rowe sat them down and Everett laid out the situation in 15 minutes. The claim, the field notes, the forgery, Edna Briggs Harold's envelope, the injunction being drafted 2 streets over. Rowe listened without interrupting, which Margaret suspected was not his natural mode. When Everett finished, Rowe was quiet for 10 seconds. "Harold Briggs was a good man," he said. "The idea that Crane used his name." He stopped himself, reset. "This needs to be public before Crane can shape what people know about it. I'll run it tomorrow. Facts only. The injunction, the field notes, the discrepancy between Crane's survey and the 1847 record, and the document Harold Briggs prepared in his own hand before he died." He looked at Margaret. "Are you willing to be quoted?" "Yes," she said. "What do you want to say?" She thought for a moment. "That the Harlow estate has honored every commitment it has made to its workers and its neighbors since Nathaniel Harlow first registered this land in 1847, and that Victor Crane has built a legal claim on a statement that a dead man prepared a written refusal against a refusal his widow has kept for 8 years and will swear to under oath." She looked at Rowe directly. "Print that." Rowe wrote it down, word for word. He looked up. "Mrs. Harlow, what did you do before you came to the valley?" "I kept my family alive," she said simply. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man who has heard exactly what he needed. "That'll be in the paper too," he said. The injunction was filed at 4 o'clock. They were on the road north by 5. The ride out of Helena was different from the ride in. Margaret could feel the difference in her own body, the release of the waiting tension, the quality of air after you have acted instead of preparing to act. They had moved. The injunction existed. The field notes were certified, and in Marsh's office, and in Rowe's desk, and in the leather satchel Margaret had kept on her lap since they left the land office. Crane would find out tonight or tomorrow morning. He would be furious. He would move. But he would be moving against something now not on open ground, and that was a different fight entirely. The night before the hearing, they did not sleep. They sat in the kitchen of the Helena boarding house at midnight, both of them dressed, Margaret with tea and Everett with coffee, the way 2 people sit when they have done everything they can do and are waiting for the doing to become real. "I keep thinking about what my father would say," Everett said. "What do you think he'd say?" He held his cup and thought about it honestly, the way he thought about things that mattered. That a man who builds something real doesn't need to fear a man who builds something false. That truth has a weight to it that forgeries don't carry. A pause. "And then he'd say I should have filed a counter-survey the moment Crane's man walked the south line." Margaret almost smiled. He'd be right about that last part. He was right about most things. Everett looked at his cup. He would have liked you. She looked at him. He had no patience for people who couldn't think under pressure, Everett said, and tremendous respect for people who could. He would have seen you in that land office the way you spoke to the clerk, and he would have come home and told Silas his son had finally done something right. The kitchen was quiet around them. Everett, Margaret said. I know it's still early, he said. I know we're still, Everett. She said it more firmly. He stopped. I'm not angry with you anymore, she said. He went still. I was angry because you didn't trust me, she said. I understand now why you didn't. Not because it was right, but because you had been given real reasons not to trust people who seemed trustworthy. And in the time since, every time I've asked you something, you've told me the truth. The accounts your father, Eleanor, the claim all of it. You haven't managed me or performed for me or tried to make it easier than it is. I haven't, he said quietly, so I'm not angry anymore. She looked at her tea. I'm something else. I don't have a clean name for it yet, but it's moving in a direction I recognize. He was quiet for a long moment. Don't make it into more than I said, she told him. I won't, he said, soft and careful. Good. They sat in the quiet kitchen and drank their tea and coffee, and outside the window, Helena was dark, and the mountains were somewhere to the north in the darkness, hiding the valley, keeping it the way they always kept it. The courtroom was full. Margaret had expected a procedural room, a judge, and 2 sets of lawyers and a handful of witnesses. What she found was a room packed with people who had decided the Harlow land case was worth seeing in person. Rose articles had done their work. The case had become something the territory was watching. Crane sat at the plaintiff's table with Thomas Webb beside him. Webb was exactly what Margaret had expected, the kind of man who has been doing this for 30 years and has learned to perform complete certainty as a professional tool. Crane himself was composed with the visible effort of a man working very hard at something. Edna Briggs sat in the second row of the gallery. She had dressed carefully, the good black wool dress she reserved for occasions of weight. When Margaret caught her eye, Edna gave a small, precise nod. Not warmth, resolve. That was better than warmth. Judge Douglas Holt entered. The room stood. The proceedings began. Webb was very good. Margaret had expected this. The precision of him, the way he built his argument like a structure designed to bear every possible load. He presented Crane's survey with quiet authority. He introduced Harold Briggs's signed statement with the careful gravity of a man handling evidence he believes to be genuine. He spoke about the boundary not as a theft, but as a correction. A 40-year error finally being addressed. A record finally being set straight. He was persuasive not because he was dishonest, but because he was skilled. And skill can make a persuasive argument about things that are not true. Then Marsh stood up. He placed the certified 1847 field notes before Judge Holt and walked through them line by line. The measurements, the bearing marks, the precise, unambiguous coordinates of the Harlow South boundary as recorded by a government surveyor 40 years ago. He did not editorialize. He did not perform. He read the numbers and allowed them to be what they were. Then he introduced Harold Briggs's own document, the envelope Edna had kept for 8 years. Marsh read it aloud slowly in the deliberate voice of a man who understands that what a document says matters less than the fact that every person in the room hears it clearly. This line is correct. I witnessed it placed. I will not sign anything that says otherwise. The gallery was very still. Then he called Edna Briggs. She walked to the witness chair with the posture of a woman who has decided exactly who she is in this moment and will remain that person regardless of what is done to her. She sat down. She folded her hands. She looked at no one in particular and waited. Webb cross-examined her with the careful respect of a man trying to dismantle testimony without appearing to dismantle a widow. Mrs. Briggs, he said, the conversation you're describing your husband telling you he had refused to sign a statement. This was 9 years ago. Isn't it possible you're misremembering the specifics? No, Edna said. Memory is imperfect over time, Mrs. Briggs. Particularly, Harold Briggs, Edna said with the precise, unhurried diction of a woman who has had 31 years of practice, being exact, told me on a Thursday evening in October of 1874 that a man had come to our house and asked him to sign a statement claiming the Harlow South boundary was 40 yards north of where it was filed. He told me the man's name was Peters. He told me he had refused because the statement was not accurate. He told me the Harlow line was exactly where Nathaniel Harlow placed it because Harold had been there and witnessed it himself. She looked at Webb without blinking. I am not misremembering, Mr. Webb. I am a precise woman. My husband was a precise man. He also wrote down what he knew and signed it and gave it to me and told me to keep it. You have just heard it read aloud. These are the things he told me, and these are the things he wrote. I am telling you the same things now. Webb paused, looked at his notes. No further questions, he said. The gallery was quiet with the quality of a room in which something important has just happened and everyone present is aware of it. Webb moved eventually to Millhaven. He described Everett's concealment of his identity, the worn clothes, the gold coin the question asked to a woman who did not know who she was answering. He built it carefully into a pattern, a man accustomed to presenting himself as something other than what he was. Everett stood without waiting for Marsh to rise. He looked at Judge Holt. Not at Webb, not at Crane. At the judge directly with the same steadiness he had looked at Margaret across a mercantile counter in October. I went to 3 towns, he said. I wore what I wore because I needed to know who would choose me, not what I owned. I found a woman who set 3 conditions before she said yes, and all 3 were about honor, not money. He paused. If that is deception, then Mr. Crane should explain to this court why he employed a man to visit a witness, before that man died, offer him money to sign something false, and then return to that witness's widow to take the record of his refusal from her grief. He looked at the judge steadily. Truth has a weight to it that forgeries don't carry. Your Honor has the field notes from 1847, and you have what Harold Briggs wrote in his own hand before he died. I'll let those speak. He sat down. The gallery did not make noise, but the air in the room changed in the specific way it changes when something is settled. Judge Holt rose and went to his chambers. In the hallway outside, while the gallery waited and the tension in the courtroom held itself carefully in place, Victor Crane walked out. He found Everett in the corridor. Everett saw him coming and did not move. Crane stopped a few feet away. For a moment, he said nothing. He looked at Everett with an expression that was not the assembled handsomeness of the yard visit, not the polished confidence of the plaintiff's table. He looked like a man who has been carrying something for a very long time and has arrived at the place where he finally has to put it down or let it finish destroying him. 40 acres, Crane said. I walk away from everything. The survey, the claim, all of it. No, Everett said. Crane looked at him. Something shifted in his face, something that was older and less managed than anything Margaret had seen from him before. Your father and my father built that road together, Crane said. They shook hands on the split, 50-50. When the payment came from the territorial government, Nathaniel took 60% and left my father with 40. My father tried to dispute it. The lawyer said the contract was clean. A pause. My father died 3 years later believing he had been cheated by the man he trusted most. The corridor was very quiet. Everett was very still for a moment. Margaret, standing a few feet behind him, watched his face and saw something move through it that was not anger and was not dismissal. It was the face of a man hearing something that has the specific weight of a thing that might be true. I don't know if that happened, Everett said finally. I was not born yet. I have my father's records and they show a clean settlement, but I was not there. He paused. If what you're telling me is true, if my father took something that wasn't his, then there is a debt. And that debt does not belong to Harold Briggs's widow. It does not belong to a forged document. It belongs between your family and mine, and it should have been settled honestly between your father and mine or between you and me years ago. He held Crane's gaze. If there was a legitimate wrong done, I will look into it. And if I find one, I will make it right. Properly. Through the truth. He paused. But not like this. Not with a dead man's name on a document he refused to sign. Crane looked at him for a long moment. Something in his face did a complicated thing, not softening exactly, not breaking exactly, but shifting the way a thing shifts when the argument you have been building for 30 years meets the one response you did not prepare for. He turned and walked back into the courtroom without another word. Margaret came to stand beside Everett. She did not say anything. She did not need to. He looked at her once briefly, and she could see in his face that he was thinking about his father, about the road contract, about the possibility that the story he had been told was incomplete. She put her hand briefly on his arm. He covered it with his own for a moment. Then they went back inside. Judge Holt took 1 hour. 1 hour in his chambers while the room waited with the compressed energy of people who have witnessed something and are waiting to find out what it means. Webb made notes with the mechanical calm of a man performing composure. Crane sat at his table and looked at no one. Everett sat beside Margaret and was still. She sat beside him and thought about nothing in particular. Not strategy, not outcomes, just the sound of the room and the light through the high windows and the clear, specific knowledge that they had done every single thing that could be done and what came next would come regardless. "You're calm," Everett said quietly. "I've sat in harder rooms than this," she said. "The night Danny's fever was at its worst, Doc Ellison told me there was nothing more to do medically, that we just had to wait, and some people his age came through and some didn't." She paused. "I sat in that room and made myself breathe and decided that whatever happened, I would be what Danny needed me to be." She looked at her hands. "This is not that room." Everett reached over and placed his hand over hers on the table. She let him. They sat like that quietly and without ceremony until the door opened and Judge Holt returned. The ruling took 11 minutes. Holt was methodical and unhurried, a man who had thought a thing completely through and was now stating the conclusion with the care it deserved. He discussed the 1847 field notes and the Crane survey and the mathematical impossibility of reconciling them without asserting the original government record was in error. He noted that no such assertion had any supporting documentation beyond the word of the man who would benefit from it. He discussed the witness statement bearing Harold Briggs's signature, and he discussed the document Harold Briggs had prepared in his own hand before his death. He looked at Edna when he spoke about it. "The testimony of Mrs. Edna Briggs," he said, "is consistent, specific, and credible. The court further notes that the document prepared and signed by Harold Briggs in November of 1874, clearly stating his refusal to attest to any claim contrary to what he had witnessed at the 1847 survey, raises serious and material questions about the authenticity of the statement submitted by the plaintiff." He set down his papers. "Questions the plaintiff has provided no evidence to resolve." Crane's hands went flat on the table. "The court finds in favor of the respondent Everett Harlow on all contested boundary claims," Judge Holt said. "The Harlow South boundary is confirmed as established in the original 1847 territorial survey filing. The plaintiff's claim is dismissed." He set down his papers. "Furthermore, this court is referring the matter of the Briggs witness statement to the territorial attorney's office for investigation into possible fraud." He picked up his gavel. "Court is adjourned." The gavel came down. The room released. Not loudly, not the way rooms release in stories, more like the sound of held breath. Let go a collective exhale, the release of something that has been held tightly for a long time, finally permitted to go. Edna Briggs sat very straight in the second row and closed her eyes briefly, and her lips moved in something private that Margaret did not try to read. Everett was very still for one moment. Then Margaret felt his hand tighten over hers. She turned to look at him. His face was doing something she had not seen before. Not the almost smile. Not the full smile. Something beyond both of those, the face of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just been told he can set it down. "We won," he said. "We won," she said. He laughed, a short, genuine surprise sound, the laugh of a man who had prepared himself for every other outcome and found himself facing the one he had most needed and had not quite let himself believe in. Marsh appeared at his shoulder, and Everett stood to meet him. Margaret turned and made her way through the gallery to where Edna was moving toward the door. Edna. Edna stopped, turned, looked at Margaret with the steady, complicated gaze of a woman who contained more than most people were allowed to see. Harold would be satisfied, she said. He should be proud, Margaret said. He was right up to the end. He planned for this. Something moved in Edna's face. Not softening exactly because Edna Briggs did not soften as a matter of policy, but something adjacent to it, something that recognized across the history of two women who had lived in the same small town without fully seeing each other that they were more alike than different. You've done well, Edna said. Up there in that valley. I'm still learning it, Margaret said. You always will be, Edna said. You just didn't have the right ground to learn on before. She straightened her coat. Come and see me when you're next in Millhaven. I will, Margaret said. Edna nodded once and went out through the door. Crane did not speak to them. He walked out with Webb beside him, and his face was the face of a man who has lost something he cannot afford to have lost, and is already calculating what comes next. Margaret watched him go and felt no triumph about it. Only the clear, factual understanding that Victor Crane would not stop easily, that the attorney's investigation would take months, that Webb would likely push for an appeal, that this was not the end of anything so much as the end of the first part of something longer. But the ground was theirs. The boundary was confirmed. The estate stood. Everything else was manageable. On the road north, 2 hours out of Helena, the conversation about Crane's claim came back to her. Do you believe him, she said, that Nathaniel cheated his father? I don't know, Everett said. I have Nathaniel's records. They show a clean settlement. But I wasn't there, and I've learned enough about my father to know he was capable of mistakes even when he was trying to do right. He paused. I'm going to look into it. When this is settled properly. If there was a legitimate debt, I want to know. Margaret looked at him. And if there was, then I pay it, he said. Whatever the correct amount is, I pay it. Not to Crane, not through his lawyers, not as a result of forged documents, but the right way to the right people if any of the Crane family can be traced back to what was actually owed. He looked at the road. That's what Nathaniel would have done if he'd known he'd made an error. It's what I'll do. She looked at the mountains ahead of them, growing larger and more specific as they climbed north, the valley somewhere behind them, the estate somewhere behind the mountains. That's why I'm not angry anymore, she said. He looked at her. A man who will look honestly into an accusation against his own father instead of simply defending him and pay a debt if he finds one, that man will not run from the truth about himself either. She looked at the road. You can be trusted, Everett. That's what I know now. Not because you're perfect, because you try to be honest even when it costs you something. He was quiet for a long moment. Margaret, he said. She looked at him. I love you, he said. It came out plainly the way he said things that mattered to him, without decoration and without apology. I know it's early, I know you're not there yet, but I've watched you for 2 weeks and I know what I see, and I'm not going to manage that or keep it back because the timing isn't clean. She looked at him for a long moment. It is too soon, she said. I know. I'm not there yet, she said. That's true. I know that too. But, she said carefully, I am closer than I was yesterday, and yesterday I was closer than the day before. She held his gaze. That's not nothing. No, he said softly. That's not nothing. Don't make it into more than I said. I won't, he said, and almost smiled. Then the full version, the one that changed his whole face into something open and unhurried and real. She looked back at the road. They arrived at the estate on the morning of the 3rd day. Danny was at the gate. He was standing with his hands in his coat pockets, watching the road, and when the wagon came through, he did not run to them, but stayed where he was and waited, which told Margaret more than running would have. He looked at their faces when the wagon came through. Well, he said, we filed an injunction, Margaret said. We found the original field notes from 1847. Edna Briggs testified. Harold Briggs left written documentation that contradicted Crane's claim before he died. The story is going to be in the paper this morning. She paused. The judge ruled in our favor on all counts. Danny was quiet for a moment. Then, so you won. The first part, Everett said. Crane will push for an appeal, but the ground is ours. Danny looked from one of them to the other. At the space between them on the bench, the quality of how they sat together, something in that space that had not been there when they left. He looked at it and said nothing about it. But something happened in his expression, quiet and certain. The expression of someone who made a bet and is finding out the bet was right. He stepped back from the gate. Silas is going to want the full report, he said, his voice perfectly level. I'll go get him. He walked toward the barn, and then he stopped just for a moment with his back to them, and Margaret saw his shoulders do the thing they did when he was trying to contain something. Then he squared them and kept walking, and she understood that her 16-year-old brother, who had looked at Everett Harlow on the first morning at the north end of Millhaven and heard the words, "We'll take care of each other," and decided that was enough, had just been proven right, and was taking a private moment to acknowledge it before coming back to be useful. Silas met them at the barn. He looked at Everett, looked at Margaret, looked at the satchel in her hand. Field notes, she said. Certified. Harold Briggs's own written record of what he witnessed, and Edna Briggs will testify. Silas put both hands on the top of the fence rail and let out a long, slow breath through his nose. Lord, he said quietly. He looked at Everett. You've got the ground under you now. We do, Everett said. Silas looked at Margaret, then at both of them together. Something in his face settled the expression of a man who has been waiting a long time for a particular thing to arrive and has just watched it walk through the gate. Ruth's made breakfast, he said. It's been warm an hour waiting for you. A pause. Don't let it get cold. He went back to the barn. Margaret looked at Everett. He looked at her. Something settled between them, not announced, not dramatic, simply the quiet settling of two people who have stopped calculating the distance between themselves and begun existing on the same ground. Breakfast, she said. Breakfast, he agreed. They walked inside together and the estate went about its morning work around them, the horses and the cattle, and the ring of the smithy, and Silas's voice low and unhurried across the yard. Ruth moved in the kitchen. Danny appeared in the barn doorway and found Silas, and the two of them began talking about something practical, something about the fence line on the east pasture, and their voices carried across the yard in the easy way of people who have found each other's rhythm. The mountain stood on three sides, holding the valley the way they had always held it, unchanged by any of the human business of the past 2 weeks. After breakfast, Margaret stood on the back porch and looked at the valley in the morning light. Everett came out and stood beside her, and the valley spread before them the same as it always had, the green of the irrigated pastures, the long, straight lines of the fencing, the three barns with their solid roofs, the herd moving slow and unhurried in the far field. The east room, she said. Second floor, 3 windows. My father's study, Everett said. I want to make it a workroom. For sewing. I have contacts in Helena now. I can take orders from there, do the work here. She looked at the valley. I need my own thing, my own contribution, not management of the house, not decoration. Work that is mine. I know, he said. He looked at the house behind them and then back at the valley. I left that room empty for 5 years, he said. I couldn't decide what to do with it. Every time I went in there, I thought about him, and I couldn't think past that. He paused. I think I've been waiting to know what it should become. She looked at him. Now I know, he said simply. She looked back at the valley and felt the whole shape of this life she had not planned for the mountains and the estate and the 22 people who had built their working days around this place. Silas and Ruth and Danny's voice in the barn, the quarterly payments that went out without fail, the account ledgers that told the truth about a man's character more accurately than anything he said about himself. She thought about a worn coat and cracked boots and a gold coin placed on a mercantile counter on a Tuesday morning in October, and a woman who had looked at that coin and seen something she could not immediately name, and had said yes to a question she had never expected to be asked, with 3 conditions and a handshake, and had walked north into mountains she had never seen to find something she had not known to look for. Until sundown, she said, the words he had used the day before when she had asked to let today be what it was before worrying about what came next. Until sundown, he agreed. They stood together in the morning quiet of the back porch, not touching, not needing to 2 people who had found each other at the north end of a town that had underestimated them both, who had built something out of conditions and a handshake and a gold coin that neither of them had been able to plan for, and were beginning in the slow, certain way of things built to last to understand what they had made. And that was enough. For today it was exactly enough.